Hey, so I made a game called Dodge King in exactly 3 months. It's a roguelike with dungeon crawling mechanics, boss fights, upgrade systems, and much more. And you might be wondering, how is it possible to make a game in exactly 90 days with all these features and, good quality, right? So today I'm going to share exactly what I did in order to make this possible. And before we begin, I'm going to go ahead and ask this very important stereotypical question, which is, hey, why is game development considered difficult and more importantly, slow? And there's a bunch of reasons that we can conclude for this, right? It could be that it's the complexity of the project, it's time management issues, it's the fact that there's a lot of technical knowledge you need to have. And how I see it personally is that as game developers, you're basically wearing a lot of hats. And these hats are their own little careers with their own little challenges and their own qualities that you have to assess. And I think the craziest part about this is, for example, you have to code a game that has clean programming and clean code as if you were a software engineer. You have to make sure that the art that's visually being presented in the game meets the expectations of a professional artist. You got to make sure that if you have a marketing campaign or a financial plan, it has to be executed like a successful business owner. And then a part of all of this, we are also human, we have our own lives, we have other things to do, and there's personal development that we have to do. Once again, when you fuse all of this, you end up getting what is a game developer. And we might feel underprepared when wearing these hats. There might be things that we have to actually take a step behind and then learn as much as we can on this little department just for that 1% in the entire development process. And so it's really easy to say it's going to be slow because you need to learn a lot of things. And it's also difficult because there's a lot of complex information that we just don't know or don't have that much exposure to. But I recently learned in this experiment of making a game in exactly 90 days, there's a lot of things we can do to not only cut corners and literally just go straight to the point of launching the game, but also there's a lot of habits that we have to keep in mind. So the number one thing you need to do as a developer today in order to make sure that you can get the result that you want of making and launching your game is to create an inflexible, non-negotiable, firm definition of exactly what your game is, where it's going to go, where it has to be, and basically with that, you create what's called an endpoint. An endpoint, at the end of the day, is the result, the goal, or literally the finality, the conclusion of where you want to reach. And so in the context of game development, our goal is to launch a game. Our goal is to make it playable. Our game is to make sure that people get to see it and play it and all of these wonderful things that are associated with it, right? So how can I make a game in 90 days if I don't know the definition of what the game is going to be? So obviously there's that planning process, there's those design choices that you have to make, but then also within those bounds of, hey, what are the correct decisions we have to make? We really have to analyze, is the decision that we're making even the correct one? And so we'll get more into that in a bit. But the long story short is that if you're always constantly moving the goalpost by adding a new feature last minute or experimenting with this new visual key, any little thing that you add that originally was not a part of your scope, in other words, over scoping, you're always going to get astrayed and you're always just basically letting the endpoint get further away from you. The whole goal is you want to make sure that every single decision you make, every single minute you spend in development, the endpoint gets closer to you. So the more you're able to focus on those correct decisions, the more efficient you will become. And the crazy part about all this is that you get to bypass a lot of the game complexities of like the whole development process. So we're going to start off with a couple of personality things that we have to kind of like self-reflect and think about, right? Because I used to be super guilty about just being impressed by the wrong things. And so this is literally like the first step of the journey. So just hear me out for a second, right? I think it's so easy to doom scroll and, pay attention to celebrity news, get into bad habits, you fall for rage bait, and priving, right? And by the way, priving means like, looking at the story of your friend they haven't checked up in a while, like things like that, right? And so when you do these actions and activities and, you spend a lot of time doing this, you kind of realize, hold on, like, is any of this, one, productive, and then two, does it benefit me, right? And so there's a lot of things that you can kind of just cut off by like unfollowing people or simply saying, hey, like, I don't really need to do this habit. I can definitely just move on. And these things are great when you get rid of them. But then when I say change what impresses you, you also have to pay attention to not only ignoring the things that don't serve you, but paying attention to things that do serve you. So I'm going to ask you a question, right? And let's say you made a game in exactly 3 months, in exactly 90 days. Would that impress you? Would you as a person self-reflect and say, wait a minute, I think that's a pretty cool milestone, right? If the answer is yes, then that's pretty cool, right? Now let me ask you this second part question. Let's say, oh, you made a game in 3 months, and you made another game in 3 months, and then you made another game in 2 months, and then you made your fourth game in 2 months. In other words, how would you feel if you made 4 games in a year? And if that also impresses you, that's good. So if these are the things that are like, whoa, that sounds amazing, like almost like impossible, that's not, like, yeah, you can actually do it, and we can talk about that in a bit. But the idea that I'm trying to show you here is, if the level of milestones that I just described to you are something that sounds really impressive, what you can do is try to achieve those milestones so that when you do achieve that milestone, you realize, wait, it is impressive to make 4 games in a year, but why can't I do more than that? You know, you keep that mindset of like challenging yourself over and over again. And so when you have the ability to create games really quickly, and then, you know, you're looking for something else that feels more impressive than getting all of that like pressure and deadline set, what happens is you start creating more of a standard for yourself on achieving these high level or like difficult obstacles that you want to do. So one, get rid of things that don't serve you, don't distract yourself like that, right? But then two, try to keep that growth mindset rolling of like, hey, I want to do this, but then when I do end up achieving what I want to achieve, I want more. I want to get better. I want to get bigger. I want to do all these things. And once you have that locked in the back of your mind, it literally becomes a self-natural process where you just get better at doing certain things, both in development, both in your personal life. So always try to raise the standard, but always figure out what impresses you and then what you could do to make it even better. And so the secret to getting any project done, okay, and I'm talking about literally any project, any endeavor, any personal goal that you want, is to set a deadline. And this is what we call Parkinson's law, which states work expands to fill the time available for its completion. And basically what this means is, hey, if I made a game in 6 months, there's going to be a lot of time, effort, resources, energy that I spend doing in those 6 months. The same amount of effort that I do in those 6 months could be done in a year if I said, hey, I'm going to make a game in a year and it's going to have these exact things. So if you know that the difference between 6 months and a year literally comes down to just how much work you're going to end up doing, regardless of how you feel about it, the point is, why would you spend more time doing an activity when you know you can save time? Would it not be more preferential for you to do things at a shorter amount of time so that you have more time for later to do other projects, or just use your time to kind of like leisure around and do other things? So Parkinson's law is the requirement for success. And this isn't an argument, this is a statement. I made this experiment where I was going to make a game exactly in 3 months, and I specifically said, I'm going to go ahead and use Parkinson's law. I cannot disrespect the 3 months. And so we're going to talk about the commitment part in a second here, because you need to recognize that as you set the deadline, you have to follow that to a T. Because if I said, let's do this in 90 days, and then, you know, it's day 86, and then on day 86, I realize, maybe I need like probably 2 more weeks and then I can actually finish. No, that's the incorrect approach of setting the deadline. Because what you really want to do is by day 86, day 87, you should be wrapping up your project. So if you approach it in the most careful way of like, I need to make my decision so that it respects the deadline at all costs, suddenly you're able to start filtering the decisions that you have to make to actually achieve the goal. And so all of this comes down to a couple of other personality traits that one should kind of practice and imbue, but you should really be mission orientated when you start deciding, how can I speedrun my game development? How can I launch my game? How can I make these features work the way that they have to? And the beautiful part about mission orientation based personalities is that it makes everything impersonal. In other words, it kind of suppresses how you personally feel about certain things, and it just kind of like throws that away. And I'm not saying, hey, emotions are wrong. Like, absolutely not. We're human. We have feelings. We have our approaches. We have things that we have to do, right? But when you approach every project as a mission, as a duty, as a responsibility to actually achieve what you want to do, you end up asking yourself, hey, I need to do this no matter what. What does it take for me to do that? And so suddenly the mindset and framework of how you're working on everything just really narrows down to, what do I do to get this result? What do I do to get that result? What do I avoid to get this part done? Okay? So as game developers, we need to learn how to make better decisions. And so I remember that I would always like experiment and tool around and just really mess up with like a lot of iteration stuff. And the problem with all of this is that you just end up getting like distracted. And the reason why I mention this is because when we're making decisions, everything that the decision entails comes down to, does it support your endpoint, right? And so Remember, endpoint at the end of the day is literally the goal, result, or the place you want to go to with your project, with your skills, with your endeavor, with your personality. All of these things must support the endpoint. So if I want to make a game in 3 months, that means I need to make decisions that benefit my progression to get to the point where I can launch the game exactly in 3 months. This means I have to respect the deadline, but now I have to take a step back. Hey, what can I actually do to make a game in 3 months, right? So that means I probably need a small scope. I probably need all my art to be done almost immediately. I need to have a playtest session done as quickly as possible, and I need to optimize my time so that I can have the ability to, keep making progress, right? So the whole point of making better decisions literally comes down to reverse engineering what your end point is. You want to do this in 3 months, then you have to figure out what are the choices you have to do so that you can actually make that possible. And so you as a human have the beautiful gift called foresight, right? And future sight. If you can see what's going to happen in 3 months, then why don't you make the decisions to actually benefit yourself so that in those 3 months you can actually reach that goal? And so the other part of making better decisions is also making and committing to hard decisions. And I really think there's two parts that come into this. Hard decisions are basically you consistently focusing and just committing to the said decision you said you're going to do no matter what, which means you're not going to be distracted. You're going to say yes to only the thing that matters. And the second part is it requires a level of impersonality that you need. This is why it's so important to be mission orientated, because if you know that, hey, there might be a system I need to make that I may not be a fan of doing, my preference is to work on the fun stuff, not the boring, like I kind of want to stray away from the boring part. But if I'm mission orientated and if I know that the hard decision is to do the boring part first because that's what's going to get me the result that I need, then that's what I have to commit to no matter what. And so we also have to ask ourselves real quick, and this is something that I think is really important because, yeah, we can say commit to this, commit to that. But what exactly is commitment, right? And so the question here is, can commitment live in a vacuum? And probably could, because commitment at the end of the day is just the decision of taking that decision and just doing that decision no matter what. But the thing about commitment is that temptation is what makes commitment stronger, right? So let me paint this metaphor real quick with this really silly dating example, right? But let's say you have a high school sweetheart and you've been dating her, everything's really good, and out of nowhere, your dream celebrity crush comes out of nowhere and says, hey, I've always been interested in you, it could be just you and me, but that means you would have to let go of your high school sweetheart, right? Now, it's up to you to choose what you want to do at this point. Personally, I don't condone cheating, and of course, I think it's obvious what the answer is here, but the idea is a one-to-one reflection for game dev. If I say I need to make this dialogue system, and then I need to make this attacking system, and then I got to do this, that means I'm not allowed to fall for the temptation of a new idea, of overscoping, of trying something new, of iterating something different. Because, I went to Twitter and I saw this developer do this visual trick, which is really cool, but, maybe if I add that, it'll make my game better. No, you are suddenly moving the goalpost of your endpoint by doing so. Oh, no, wait a minute. I just added this last-minute weapon. It should be really cool to add, right? No, again, the more you unconsciously choose to do things that do not directly support the end goal of launching your game as quickly as possible, the more time gets created to continue working on your project. And so when you continue endlessly making these micro unconscious decisions of temptation and distractions of you just, hey, I gotta really keep trying these new things, suddenly it's, I need more time to fix this, or I need more time to do that, I need more time. And then the more time you create to fix all these things, the further away you're getting from the endpoint. So commitment has to be defined. Commitment has to be the conscious choice of saying yes to what matters and saying no to the distractions that, they might be great, they might be shining objects, they might be like, this is actually cool, but it's just something that you really have to learn how to decide on doing. And so again, I was super guilty about this because the very first game that I made, I never properly finished it. It took a year and a half before I realized why do I keep over scoping? And it's because I kept adding features and features and features when in reality, I never defined my end goal. And then I also realized, but this looks cool, so I want to try that out. And so, yeah, there's experimental phases and there's exceptions, but I would say if you really want to be critical about getting and launching the game, you have to be super critical on making the right choices that do not distract you from what you have to do. And so the other part about this is that we tend to be I'm personally a huge perfectionist, okay? I get mildly annoyed when I find out, man, this could have been better, this and that. But the thing about perfectionism is that it's a falsehood of what progress looks like. The biggest issue is that if you are working for progress, that means you probably want to have a feature that does its bare minimum function and feel fun, but then that's it. The problem with perfectionism is that once you reach that stage of, oh, this works, but it could also be better, the problem is you start improving it over time, and this endless cycle falsifies the idea that, wait a minute, I am making progress because it is getting higher quality, it's getting better, it's doing this, it's doing that. But by you putting so much time into that one area, you are avoiding making general progress for the entire project. And so what I recommend is always make a feature at its bare minimum, make sure that it's fun, and then move on to the next task. If you need to optimize that because the player asked you to do so via player feedback, then that's totally fine. But if you're just constantly there and saying, oh, I gotta fix this, I gotta fix this, I gotta fix this, then it becomes a time sink. So perfectionism is actually the enemy when it comes to speedrunning your game development. So really find ways to avoid that, and that means you have to consciously pay attention to what actually matters. And so this is also going to tie into this next point here where I say, hey, we need to die on experiences, not expectations. So let me clarify what that means, because this kind of sounds a little funny, right? But as you can see in this clip, I made a parry mechanic for my game, right? And there's this character named Laura, and she's the only character that has access to parrying, unless you get an upgrade that actually allows you to parry, right? The idea of parrying is, hey, when you attack, the moment you get attacked, you basically get an invincibility frame, and that's it. Now, the idea behind this is the experience of you parrying should be fun. But look how bare bones it is. It's just a simple, hey, if this happens, let this effect occur, and that's it. And so the reason why we say it's so important to make sure that you die on the experience of making sure that it's fun is because players may say, oh, but parrying should have a health mechanic. Parrying should make me more stronger. Parrying should reward me with other things. And while those things are absolutely valid, you need to focus more on the fun factor rather than what it could be. Because once the fun part is there, once the actual mechanic works and does what it has to do, again, you are now allowing yourself to make more progress to the game and just keep doing all the general things that you have to do in your project to keep making progress. If you notice that, man, maybe my players would need this or would like that, and then ultimately it doesn't reach the goal that you want, you're just adding on to that perfectionism. And so, let me be clear one more time. Make a minimum, make it fun, make it work, and if that's the case, you move on. Don't be a perfectionist. Don't keep cycling over and over. And so the only exception for this that I would argue is you can't underperform your scope needs. So for example, if I say, hey, Dodge King is a roguelike game, that means I'm going to have to integrate roguelike elements to actually support what I'm saying. And so, yeah, there's some roguelikes that they don't have these relic systems, and that's absolutely fine. But the whole point that I'm trying to say is that if I told you, oh, my roguelike supports upgrade systems, the upgrade system itself should look like what the general stereotypical roguelike would do, which is, oh, you level up, and then you have a choice of items that you can pick. And so this is important because when you meet that player expectation, you're allowed to get away with a lot of the experience that we just talked about. So again, maybe the player would have liked if parrying did extra abilities, right? Like did extra things. But at the same time, the parrying is fun enough for them to say, hey, this is good, and I'm okay with that. So now I say, oh, by the way, it's a roguelike. Well, the expectations are already set because, hey, I need to actually deliver on this. So I can't half bake this entire system here. So I realized, wait a minute, roguelikes give you the 3 options. You get to choose. They give you a skip button. And I could have honestly simplified this because maybe re-rolling wasn't necessary, but I added that, which meant I had to add a currency system with it. And things work like that, right? But the whole point I'm trying to say is that you must make the game fun. You must make the bare minimum features work and doable, but also on the things that do matter the most, on the genre expectations, you have to make sure that you're performing the way that a typical genre element would do. So like I said, roguelikes have upgrade systems. You probably want to make a good upgrade system, all right? And what this basically all entails is that you want to make sure that the businessman meets the artist. And this is kind of like a funny little background thing because maybe we come from a hobbyist background where it's like, oh, I'm doing this as a fun thing. I'm an artist first. And then I realize, oh, I want to make money from the game. Or maybe it's the opposite where you're like, hey, I wish I could just make money in games, but I don't have the artist skills or this and that. And so the point that I'm trying to assess here is that you want to synthesize the businessman and the visionary. And so the visionary is basically how does the game look? How is it fun? How is it all of these things? But the businessman is what are the technical design decisions that I have to make so that it optimizes player growth, player markets, and then when I synthesize that with the gameplay, players can have an expectation of what the game is without being disappointed. And then the consequence of that is that suddenly you made a game that people are going to be interested in. And of course, there's a whole marketing conversation about this, but the idea is, hey, if I'm making a roguelike, I should have roguelike elements. If I'm making a narrative game, I should have a lot of narrative elements. And so you need to optimize your choices, your decision, and your endpoint. And remember, this all comes back to defining what the endpoint is based off of what the businessman and the artist synthesize towards. So like I said, the endpoint is I'm going to launch a roguelike. Therefore, the decisions I have to make are based off of how many roguelike systems do I need? What are the most important roguelike items that I need, elements? And then fuse all of that, boom, I now have a roadmap of what to do. Okay, so to make a roguelike in 3 months, I need to have an upgrade system, I need to have art, I need to have a core gameplay loop that's repetitive, and then a lot of self-generating like levels and such, right? And then you suddenly have a checklist of all the things that you have to do. You as a visionary execute, but you as a businessman made the roadmap to make this happen so that other players can see what's going to happen, okay? The next thing I'm going to talk about is that you should learn how to ask better contextual questions. I was super guilty about this, and this is super normal when you're learning something new for the first time. But the problem about a general question is that you're going to get a general answer. And this is not efficient for you when you're working on your project, especially with a tight deadline. Contextual questions basically means you want to have as much context and details for the question. When you do this, your solution, your answers are going to be not only more contextual, not only are they going to have more evidence and support that you need, but the variety of answers you're going to get are going to be higher quality. And the crazy part about this is that the more you look at the deeper the question, and then like the more details the question has, the more details the answer is going to have. When you correlate that together, you end up saying, wait a minute, I can ask one simple question that has all these details, and I'm going to get answers to all of these things, and then I can execute quicker. For example, hey, how do I fix this syntax to allow me to get X result? I'm going to get the answer, and then because it's a one-to-one direct answer, boom, I solve the problem and I move on. But if I ask a generic question, for example, I found this one, oh, how do I make a 3D melee combat? You're going to get a lot of general answers because that's super open-ended. And so, by the way, a quick Google search shows you these 4 videos, right? And these are pretty lengthy. They have their own respective like needs from start to end, how to work on it. But this also is important for a person to consider for 2 reasons. Like I said, you want to be clear with your questions. You can get clearer, better answers, and then be more efficient. But number 2, if you're asking basic questions, you are probably lacking what's called the self-starter characteristic. Meaning, if the question is so basic, you should probably withhold asking the question so that you can research, Google, do a little bit of like context, like, okay, what do I need to know to actually formulate a better question? And again, there's exceptions to this because sometimes we just don't know what we know, and that's okay. And so these are things that you can work on. But the thing is, you should really consider being a self-starter person when you have these type of questions in your mind, because that would allow you to propel yourself to work harder on finding better answers, better solutions, so that you can integrate that quickly. And then the more self-reliant you are, the better you are at using resources. Consequently, what happens with your progress? You start progressing. Remember that, okay? It's super important to develop mannerism, respect, and be professional. I'm going to talk about the mannerism and respect part in a second, but professionalism is super important because it allows you to treat and approach work differently. So if I told you, hey, you have a job and you have to clock in from 8 to 5, right? Then guess what? You're going to do everything possible to respect that. You're going to get up in the morning, you're going to cook in the morning, you're going to shower, you're going to dress up, and then you're going to go to your job. You're going to clock in exactly at 8. You're going to perform high-level quality work from 8 to 5. You have your breaks, you have your lunch break, whatever. You clock out. And from when you clock out till the next day, you completely ignore that because you are going to focus on your personal life. So what happens when you take that professional mindset and simply apply it to your personal endeavor or project? Well, guess what? If I treat my job professionally, and then if I treat my personal project professionally, that means the level of quality I'm going to have to pay attention to will be delivered. So if I say, hey, at 5 through 10 every single day, I'm going to mentally clock in, work on my project, on my game, on my coding, and that means when I get to that, I have to cut my distractions. I have to make sure everything's set. I have to do the chores and the day-to-day tasks to actually sit down and do what I have to do. So by you treating your work professionally, you start making this approach of, wait, this is a serious thing that I have to take care of. And so when we talk about mannerism and respect, right, this is super obvious and, it's expected of us to just be very clear with like, hey, make sure that you treat everyone good and that every individual gets respected, that they have their time. These are important things, but this is very beneficial for you as a person because when you're networking as a game developer, you're always going to meet a lot of people. You're always going to see a bunch of different perspectives, unique ways to just see how people think. And paying attention to this is really important because you start to gain more value and insight about how to manage a project, about how to solve a specific problem, about maybe you find someone that can help delegate your work as well. Like there's a lot of benefits you can have when you really treat people good. And I highlight here that we should act like highly educated people because highly educated people in general are very aware of multiple situations. So if they can be aware about the social part and then they can be aware about the career part and then their health part and then how they treat others, by us emulating those actions, we basically get more leverage on learning how other people think. And the crazy part about this is that we also need to learn how to listen. And listen, I'm super bad at this, and this is something I actively try to do to improve because when you interrupt somebody, you're basically just trying to respond for the sake of responding. And that's such an incorrect way to go about it because when you really think about it, again, listening allows you to learn new perspectives and see someone's point of view from a completely different worldview from you. And, somebody might say something conclusive that you might say, like, you can see them talking in that sentence and say, oh, I know exactly what they're going to say next, so now I'm going to interrupt. Wait. Let them finish because you'd be surprised how many times people kind of, like, change their sentence halfway and then they talk about something else. But the important part that I'm trying to say is let them finish their words and take 5 seconds to just be silent and think about how you're going to respond to them. By doing this, you're basically allowing yourself to have a little bit more time to cook a good answer and reply the way that you have to. But more importantly, you're showing the other person the fact that you respect and value their time to the point where it's like, okay, let me actually see what you're trying to say, because there's a lot of people that have amazing intentions and that they want to help you out as much as possible. Just be aware that to truly reach the level of listening in a good way, you need to be patient too. So take the time to listen and don't respond just to respond. Just give it a second, think about it, and see what happens. And so everything that I just said since this at this point does not matter. I'm going to repeat this one more time. Everything that I just said does not matter if you are not a person of integrity. And so integrity, in my opinion, has to be one of the most important values because it basically means that you have a track record, that your words and your actions are tied together. It means that you're honest and transparent and that when you say you're going to do something, you're actually going to do it. And so it's so easy for me to tell you, oh yeah, let me show you what I would do. But then me telling you a theoretical, while there's space and time for that, would be incorrect because I personally would like to talk about experiences, right? I'm telling you how to do a game in 90 days, the things you have to do, because I just did an experiment where I actually made and launched the game in 90 days. These are the tricks and tips that I did. So you need to focus on, okay, if what I'm saying is true, then I need to have the evidence to back it up. And then more importantly, I can show you that, right? So if you lack integrity, that means you're going to lack the skills and the traits that I've just mentioned for you to actually make hard decisions. You're going to lack the integrity of following that endpoint. You're going to lack the integrity to follow the deadline. You need to make sure that everything you say you're going to do is actually something you're going to do. And if integrity is something you struggle with, then that's something that you have to really work on. So how do you know if you're a person that's, very integrous, right? Well, ask yourself this little funny scenario. Let's say somebody said something hyper controversial. How would you react? Would you be hyper honest? Would you kind of react emotionally? Would you respond quickly? And I say the situation here because sometimes when a very controversial piece comes out, most of us kind of have a different way how we react with it. And so a person of integrity would just react regardless of how they, regardless of how other people would feel. They would just kind of speak their truth, right? So brief example. Hey, Dodge King exists. You can play it right now. By the way, it's on Steam. By the way, if you look at the Steam page, it's going to say launched on October 7th, 2022. And that's because the first version of it was launched exactly in 3 months. And when this occurred, this is exactly what happened. I decided to make a sequel for Dodge King called Dodge King Deluxe Version. What does that mean? I ported the full second game into the first game, so there's no way to play the first game, but now you can play this game right now. This is me being transparent. This is me being truthful. This is me telling you exactly why this exists, and this is the evidence behind it. It would be rude if I told you, oh yeah, I made the greatest game of all time, whatever. It's called Another Chance. It doesn't exist. It's not done. It's not playable. Me telling you about this has no merit because there's no evidence that proves what I'm saying. But there is merit to Dodge King because guess what? I just released it and you can actually access it. And I would also argue that it would be very weird for me to talk about my next project if I don't have proof that it exists. So I should probably wait until I have the fact that, hey, this exists and everything. But more importantly, if my track record is correct, if I'm full of integrity, then it would be okay for me to talk about these projects because, yes, I got to the point where I can do that. So you as a developer need to practice integrity and most importantly, holding things dearly, right? And so without integrity, everything that I just said does not matter. And I'm going to repeat the slide again because guess what? If you lack integrity, you can't finish the deadline. If you say, hey, I'm going to do this in 90 days, and then on the 80th day I realize I need another week, you did not focus on the 90 days. 90 days means from day 1 to day 2 to day 3 to day 10 to day 15 to day 25. Every day counts. It's not, oh, well, day 26 seems like a good day off. And this, no, because if you do that, you're, again, pushing away the endpoint. You need to be assessing the standard at its highest level, and this means following the deadline to a T. And so I'm a huge person that likes talking about being opportunistic with time. I have a bunch of controversial ideas, things that I've executed on, and basically it's, hey, like, go to bed early and then wake up earlier and then bring your laptop at work so that on your lunch break you keep coding. Learn how to say no to friends that are constantly asking you to go out. Kind of suppress your activities and such. And so you do this so that you can create more time and opportunity to keep working on your projects and such. And so if you want more details about this specifically, I made a video called Powerful Habits to Make Games Quickly. And it basically has a list of things you can do to basically min-max your time. And, it might be a little controversial, but again, these are things that you have to do because sometimes balance just has to be thrown out the window to achieve the things that you have to do. Part of the hard decision making is, what am I going to sacrifice in order to get to the point that I want to get to? The other thing that I'm also going to say here is that you should view making game development as a system, not a hobby. And I have no beef with anybody that uses game dev as a hobby. If you're a hobbyist, I hyper respect you. I hyper admire you. I think it's one of the greatest ways how you can spend your time because you're constantly having like fun problems and challenges that you're solving. And don't get me wrong, hobbyists can definitely use these tips and ideas, and there are successful hobby indie game developers that do what they have to do because they do set deadlines or they do optimize their games to the point where it helps the market. I'm just saying that if you approach it as a system, you start to treat it less fun, and then all of those hard parts that we talked about, those boring issues, those motivational parts where like, I want to be motivated to do this, you completely bypass that because you're now approaching this as something more systematic and robotic. And so, yeah, that might be a little controversial and such, but these are the efforts you have to do to take game dev a little bit more seriously in the terms of, hey, I want to make these goals achievable, right? Especially at a short amount of time. And so this also ties into the social and technical environment that you have to do. Let's take one step back, okay? I think the majority of us are extremely privileged to have basic necessities, right? Most of us here have electricity, we have food, we have water, we have a place to sleep, we have a fridge, right? We have a healthy mindset on these things, and these are absolutely great. The thing is that while, be grateful for what you have and, we're privileged for this, there are certain developers that simply just don't have access to this. And so I'm not exaggerating when I say that I currently live in a place where we have a power outage once a week. And so I sometimes don't have access to electricity. And so the problem with this is that my environment, is not suited for development because, hey, if I can only be productive 6 out of 7 days, that's actually really bad. And that's something that I need to work on. So on the other hand of this, I would also say either change your environment so that it's best optimized for you to work on your stuff. But more importantly, don't make excuses. And I'm telling you this from actual experience where, hey, like I had a power outage. So what did I do? I brought my backup laptop. I went to a cafe. And here I basically had access to food. I had access to electricity. If I wanted to have more privacy, I would put on headphones. And there are things you can actually do to optimize and have backup plans because, yes, it's true. We don't have control of every single situation that life throws at us. Like, life can be very difficult. I can recognize that. But if you really are going to take the goal of launching your game as quickly as possible, there's going to be extra things that you have to consider that go beyond the scope of actual game development. And so here's another thing. We're talking about technical environment, right? But in social environment means you want to have friends that support you. You want to have people that, actively like what you're doing. And you got to be careful because sometimes, you might be hanging out with the wrong group of friends where they say, oh, yeah, you'll never achieve that. Or they kind of insert those doubts in your mind. And you don't have time to afford to listen to that. And also, I would say you can have environmental advantages. So, for example, let's say you are currently privileged to work at a remote job. If that's the case, That means you have more flexibility to have your computer on in the background. And then guess what? Like when there's a small little break at work, oh, let me just hop on, write this code real quick, and then go back. If you have a partner that's very supportive of what you do, right, and then they help you with, I don't know, like chores, or they like are very supportive in general, they help you with assets, they help you delegate, then that's absolutely amazing. That's an environmental advantage that you have. If you go to work, but the commute is literally 2 minutes because you're like right next to work, guess what? You don't have to spend an hour a day going back and forth to work. So there's definitely other things that you have to consider within your environment to actually have an advantage of getting more time, more support, and more resources to pushing forward your project, right? And this is why I say like, hey, like make sure you allocate your time a little bit more selfishly. A little controversial, but like I said, make sure you say no to people that are constantly trying to ask you to go out. The whole point is that there's only one of you. And so it's okay to take breaks. It's okay to do these things. But the severity of how serious you take your goals is equivalent to how serious you say no to things and how selfishly you're able to use yourself to finish the project. So just remember that, you have the choice to do whatever you want in your life. And I'm not here to tell you what to do, right? But I'm saying that for me personally, I remember that I had to say no to going out a bunch of times. I had to kind of just like deny and deprive myself of saying, hey, like maybe this would be a good idea if I took some time to take a break, but I really need to double down on the system, and I would do that. So really focus on that, all right? And then I made this huge mistake where I did a feedback loop for my developers, for my playtesters, a week before launch. And the biggest issue with that is you receive really good feedback, and then you realize, I don't know if I have an entire week to finish everything that was asked for, right? So shout out to Chris Cesario, Venator, and Tenko Studios, who basically wrote this document about things I should fix in the game. And we were able to fix and implement it. So now the game is like really fun and it works and everything's great. But I remember saying, man, if only I could do this super early, I wouldn't have that stress of, oh my gosh, am I gonna have to cut even more content or, cut corners to actually make this achievable. So make sure that in your endeavors, you implement feedback as early as possible, because that is the game changer of how you actually satisfy the player expectations and measure if the game experience for the player is fun. So you need to do this early and super early. Like this is so critical, okay? And also there's all types of feedbacks, criticisms, tangible ones. Make sure that you're choosing the right battles. And I'm gonna have that conversation in a bit because we can talk about that in a second. But really feedback is important. And part of the feedback is also about drilling. And drilling is a concept that I like talking about, which is a trick to build your tolerance, confidence, problem-solving skills, and progression. Drilling, in essence, is basically saying, let me take this really hard problem and do absolutely nothing but focus on it, right? And so, you have that classic idea where you take a shower while you're, like, really stressed, and then as you're, like, relaxing and washing your hair, you're like, oh, wait, I should have done this, right? There's moments where you can take breaks, and that's absolutely fine, and more importantly, that helps you solve these issues. The thing about drilling is that if you focus on a really hard problem, and then you suddenly say, hey, this is hard, let me pause this, and let me just like work on this other problem, you're ultimately doing yourself a disservice. The reason why is because you're pushing yourself at a position where, one, you're halting the progress of what's actually important, which is that one hard problem, and by you creating the ability to just shift into a different problem, you're indirectly making a habit where you're just focusing on the wrong thing. And yeah, it might be something else that pushes progress for the entire project, but the reason why it's a disservice is because when you stick to drilling, when you stick to that one problem that you're grazing about and you're just constantly there, you're indirectly building tolerance for dealing with harder problems. And the crazy part about this is that if you realize, wait, this is a really difficult problem, but I'm going to go ahead and challenge it with all my might, and I'm not going to stop until I finish it, not only do you build a tolerance for harder problems, but when you do solve it, you build the confidence of realizing, wait, I am capable of solving really hard problems, even if it's like a last minute thing that showed up. In addition to that, you just basically prove to yourself that you have problem solving skills that no matter how difficult or complex something is, you end up, beating it. And then the last part is, and the best part, you have a solution that if another problem just like this showed up, you would know what to do. And this all conjoins to making more progress on launching your game. So there are going to be moments where you're like, man, I really want to rip my hair out. Did I really get into this problem? How is this possible? It's been 3 days, like this, I can't find the line of code. That's okay, because once you learn how to fix it, you just become a better developer, a better problem solver, a more confident person, a person that has more tolerance, you make more progress. There's so many benefits to drilling. So yes, it is frustrating, but behind the frustration and after you go through the wall of that frustration is so many rewards, and I cannot stress how important it is to constantly get in the habit of drilling. And so, going back to real quick, the whole feedback thing, there's a bunch of problems that we're gonna run into, right? Obstacles is what we call them. But while obstacles are meant to be challenged, did you know that you can just bypass them entirely? And so you need to learn as a developer and in general, just as somebody that engages in projects or personal endeavors, you need to know when to pick up the correct fight. If you're taking the wrong fight, you're gonna lose time, you're gonna lose energy, you're gonna lose resources. If you pick the right fight and win the fight, then guess what? You just basically, guess what? Do more progress. So for example, in this screenshot here, originally the game was gonna have this thing called retro mode. And retro mode is literally saying, oh yeah, in Dodge King 2, you can access Dodge King 1. And I thought this was an amazing idea because, hey, like, what if the player wanted to play the game the same way that it was designed super early, right? In the first version. And the problem with this is that all the new overlapping systems I was making were causing so many bugs for the first version. And then I realized, okay, hold on. I need to fix retro mode. There's a bunch of problems. I got to fix this bug, this and that. And then I realized, no, I can't do that because I'm fixing game number 1 when the priority is game number 2. That's me shifting the goal. So I said, no, I got to get rid of retro mode because if I don't, I'm just furthering myself away from the endpoint. And by the way, there's 3 major features I was going to have, which was retro mode, again, going from version 1 to version 2, like choosing whatever you want. And then I also had another chance mode, which is the literal demo of my other game inside of Dodge King. And originally it was there and it was functioning, but there were still some bugs. It wasn't super presentable. And so why would I work on another game when I'm trying to prioritize and finish one game at a time? So I always say don't multitask, always focus on one thing at a time. But essentially this game was going to have 3 games in one. Version 1 Dodge King, another chance, and then version 2 Dodge King. Do you think it's possible in 90 days to work on 3 games? Maybe, but I'm just not going to take that risk because there's just too many things to do. And also, I'm a one-person team, so I can't just say, oh, well, let me do this and that. Maybe in the future context where I had a teammate and I had delegation to do, this could be a thing, but ultimately, it does not support the end goal either. Why would I focus on literally a demo of another game when it has nothing to do with the actual game I'm making? So remember that when you're developing. The third feature that I was going to talk about is multiplayer. And one, I thought this was going to be super amazing, it was going to be super fun and everything, and there's a lot of merit behind the idea. But the problem with this is that every single game object that I was going to make for the characters would behave differently if it were just... So like multiplayer would have their own set of rules, and then single player would have a different set of rules. I remember making the multiplayer menu, as you can see here, in the first week of development, and I slowly realized, wait a minute, if I double down on this, every single system I design from here and onwards is basically going to have double the effort because I have to consider player 1 and then player 2, but also I have to test multiplayer, then I have to test online stuff, then I have to test a bunch of issues, and I realized I could just cut that and 80% of the stress just disappears. And now when I did that, now every single modular system I write is now going to be flexible and improves and supports the one-player experience. So now I can deliver even higher quality for a one-player experience versus a low-quality game with multiplayer. And so it's really interesting when you can see, wait a minute, like this idea might be really cool. But again, when you're mission-based, when you're really focused on getting to that goal, you just become impersonal. You just, hey, I love this idea, but hey, it's not going to work out. That's okay. Boom. I arrest myself to get to the point, and that's why I removed multiplayer, right? And so code magnitude matters more than you think, and this is literally what I just described with multiplayer, right? But like, imagine that you're testing and polishing, and you're getting your bugs down. You're like, yeah, we're making progress, we're doing good. And as you're polishing, you're like, hey, wait a minute, this would be really cool if I added this one feature. Boom! That last minute feature or that scope creep is always going to reset your progress because adding features is not linear, it's exponential, no matter what. And so I remember that I had this extremely simple idea of, hey, the parrying thing actually, right? Hey, when I parry, I want the background to be white really quickly when I parry. And I remember when I added that, I was like, this is so simple. It's a one fix add, we're done. And what happened was there was an enemy that had a different layer of background. So when I did the white parrying thing, the screen would actually be a different color. That wasn't the white screen. And I said, okay, so now I had to look into the enemy script and then realize, oh, the layer of their background is the same number as parrying, so let me just move that back by 1. And then when I parried, well, guess what? The enemy background is now messing up the level background. And so it's just like, bro, it's just one change. Like, how did all of this happen? Because every little change you do is exponential. It's not linear. It's never going to be linear, especially here in game dev. So be very careful with what you're adding. And again, the more definitive your goal is, the less you moved your goal, the quicker you're gonna get to it. The more you move it, the more you experiment, the more you say, oh, I should add this and that. You're just gonna keep back progressing yourself. So like you need to make sure, hey, like don't add these last minute things. And it's very hard because again, I'm telling you from experience, it's so tempting to just, oh, I just really want to try this. I just want to see how this works maybe in the future. But you really got to make sure that no, you have to double down on everything that you currently said you were gonna do. So don't dismiss the deadline. Remember, we're trying to respect, honor, and work with the deadline as much as we can. And I really believe that if you're not consciously improving your skills, if you're not doing decisions that make you a better person, a better developer, a better project manager, a better programmer, a better artist, if you're not making these active decisions, you're not improving your skills. And if you can't improve your skills, you're wasting time. The conclusion that I'm trying to get to this here is that the more skills you have, the more efficient you will become as a developer. And so logically, if I'm more efficient, that means I can code faster. That means I know what mistakes to avoid. That means I know what works, what doesn't. And so you really want to make sure that every decision you make has a level of improvement for you, because once you do this over time, you're learning how to become a better, faster, more efficient person. And so it's easy to say, oh, but if I'm hyper skilled, that means I can do like bigger projects, right? To an extent, of course, that's kind of the consequence. So you really want to make sure that no matter what you do, you're absolutely making sure that you are improving your skills 24/7. And this basically concludes, hey, if you have more skills, you're going to have less friction, right? So on the left, you can see here that this is how the game looks like, a little laggy right now on the screen. But, it's like all of these systems that I've made come in this cohesive, like, good experience, right? Whereas to the right, you can see, wait a minute, like, this is my first prototype. It's very sloppy. It's messy. There's a bunch of issues with that. And that's because I didn't have any skills. So you just get better when you start to realize, hey, wait a minute, I can just get better at my skills and I can be faster, and it's really good. And also, just because a piece of advice may sound impractical does not mean it should be dismissed. And so I mentioned earlier, hey, you got to throw out balance outside the window for a temporary amount of time, right? This is the example that I'm trying to allude to, but sometimes we view impracticality as just, hey, this is uncomfortable, this is wrong, this is messed up, this is weird, this is something I don't want to do. But maybe if you try those habits, if you kind of challenge yourself to do those things that are very interesting or difficult or different, even though it might not be effective immediately, they might have some merit. So I would just say, be experimental with how you approach your problems, because you really never know what actually works until you try it, right? And so here's another huge tip that I was so ignorant about until I actually applied it. And most of the conversation I'm having here is, hey, you want to make your game as quickly as possible, which implies that you want to have a small scope. The problem with small scope games is that they're kind of viewed as like, they're micro games, they're short, they're little, which not necessarily true. You can make a very long replayable game in 3 months. But the whole point is that when you do a small game, you end up having a little amount of features, right? And so I remember thinking, man, when I make my dream game, it's going to have all these systems, it's going to do all these crazy things. And that's always what I'm thinking about at the background. But the reality is, hey, I need to make sure that I take things step by step. And so the biggest advantage of doing this is that you indirectly create assets for yourself. So let me explain. The very first game I made had a grid system, an enemy wave spawner, and a card select system, as you can see on the screen, right? And I realized, wait, these are all modular. It's just a couple of variable changes and I can use them for my next project, right? So when I was making Dodge King again, I realized, wait, I can just grab these assets, put in the game, and work on it. Now, when I completed Dodge King, I realized, wait a minute, I also have a modular character select screen, a customization menu, a upgrade, the classic roguelike upgradable menus with the relics and everything. And I'm like, whoa, these are pretty cool features that are modular. Again, I can just import them anywhere else and they work, right? Do you know what that means? That means automatically the next game I make has access to these features. That doesn't mean I have to use them all, but now if I wanted to make another game because of these assets that I've created because they're small scoped, my next game can now be a grid-based mover with an enemy spawner, with a card selector, with an upgrade selector, with a customization menu, with a character select, and they're already done. The hard part of doing these systems are already done. I literally can import them, change a couple of visuals, change a couple of variables, and then I already have 6 major features that could make up 80% of my next game. So asset pooling is one of the quickest tricks you can ever do to just get your game done, because you're using all the features and systems that you need to actually, finish your game. And so the more little games you complete, and the more different that these systems are, the bigger your pool of assets you have that literally can just be imported for your next project. And then again, before you know it, making the next game not only is faster because you already improved your skill, but you already have the assets to just literally import what you need and then just work a little bit, just work way less because you already have what you need. And so you want to make that dream game with these 50 billion assets, okay, then make those micro games that have those sectionalized systems so that when you have all that set, import it into that project, work on the visuals, change a couple of variables, boom. 50% of your game, 75% of your game, 80% of your game can be completed just by doing this. Is that not a speedrunning trick? And so this is why it's so important to keep working on small scoped games so that you can just continue compiling and compounding these assets. Once you have all of that, making bigger games suddenly becomes easier because the hard lifting, the heavy lifting is already done. I'd also like to mention, shout out to RODev here, who made this amazing video about how to upload games to Steam, but I'm a huge person when it comes to bookmarking. And what I mean by this is I have a document on Google Drive that has links of where I need to go to I need to upload this game, or I need tasks that they're common, but not things that you necessarily learn on the spot. Because I remember when I launched my first game, I saw this exact video, so it took me more than 11 minutes to comprehend because I had to pause, go back and forth, rewind, things like that, right? But now I remember thinking, okay, I need to upload the game. What do I do again? Oh yeah, I looked at the document. In the document, there's a link to this video. Oh yeah, in the document, there's a comment that says go to this timestamp because this is how it explains the Steam GUI SDK. Oh, there, boom, I spent 2 minutes watching it and I'm set. So what I'm trying to say is if you get in the practice of bookmarking your resources that, again, it could be common problems that you run into or the problems that you don't learn, bookmarking your references to figure out these resources as quickly as possible is something that's very effective and literally helps you speedrun those really big obstacles that already have the solution ready for you. You just have to quickly check your book and then go, all right? Speaking of bookmarking, I also am a huge firm believer that you need to have a script, a document, or some type of place that describes where your scripts are going to be located, right? So what you're looking at on the screen right now is this is the unlocked script, right? This is the script that's responsible for unlocking your characters, your game modes, every other thing, right? And I remember thinking, oh, okay, right. So I need to make sure that I document where the win condition is to actually unlock the character, right? So for example, there's this character called Mycene who you unlock after you beat 100 enemies. And I was like, okay, well, obviously, I go to the results screen because the results screen is what counts how many enemies you've defeated. And so what happens is that's already a false premise because if I'm looking at the results screen, you're going to realize, wait a minute, this condition does not exist in the results screen. Where was it again? Well, guess what? It was located in the records script. Why? Because I made a note here that says Mycene is in record script, and this is where the 100 condition is. So notice how I just gave you a false premise of, I go to the results screen because the results screen obviously is what counts the kills. No, records is the script that counts the kills. So I could have saved time by not going to the results screen and then searching left and right and digging into the code and reading every line and going back and forth. I could have saved all that time by saying, oh, wait a minute, it's in the records script. That's it. So have a document that documents where everything is. Once you do that, finding those conditions are extremely easy. And so you want to do this for conditions that are very important, and more importantly, things that are likely to change. Because fun fact, Mycene was actually going to be unlocked after you kill 1,000 robots. But also, hey, 1,000 is kind of a lot, right? So let's kind of lower that threshold so that players have access to her as quick as possible. And so I said, okay, so I'm going to mark the kill rate, the 100 kill rate, in the records script so that if I changed my mind, I would just go there, fix the variable, and we're done. Always keep your bookmarks straight. And speaking of documenting and bookmarks and everything, measure your development, okay? Fun little fact, every 2 days, I would write notes on exactly what I did with my game. And more importantly, if there was a problem that I solved, I would write the solution with it. The crazy part about this is that you get to see patterns of how you are improving your development, things that you are paying attention to, things that you forgot to do, things that you can catch up on. And what's really interesting about writing is that at the end of the day, it's actually you basically doing this deep level of self-reflection because you're physically writing onto the world, hey, these are actions that I've committed. These are actions I've done. And based off of that, you can read the patterns of how you're developing, how you're skipping, how you're optimizing. And I remember that I was spending a lot of time on testing and polishing a lot of my systems, right? And I realized I'm spending way too much time testing something that's really simple, right? And for context, I was trying to test the final boss, right? But to get to the final boss, you had to actually beat like 5 levels in a row, this and that. And each time I played through that, that would take a while, right? Because the level is, it could take time, it could be random, like who knows. So I realized as I'm writing this down, I'm recognizing, wow, this boss system that I'm working on doesn't really, it's taking too much time to test. How do I deal with that? And I know it sounds obvious, but by me reading what I did, I realized, oh, why don't I just make a configuration file that literally teleports me to the final boss room with this weapon, with this condition, and that's it. So I would write that script. It took me 20 seconds, not 20 seconds, like maybe 2 minutes, whatever, and then boom, I could start testing that part consistently. And I could only notice that if I sat down and just measured exactly what I'm doing. Because when you measure something, you have the metrics to prove if you're actively getting to your goal or if you're actively straying away from your goal. So it's a really healthy thing to do, and I seriously recommend you doing that often. I just did it every 2 days, and speaking of every 2 days, I would also recommend you backing up everything. If you have GitHub, if you have a version controller, Plastic, that's great, like use it, right? But I'm a kind of like an old timer here when I say, oh yeah, I use the copy paste method onto my terabyte, and it might be boring and slow and even tedious, but it's something that's so hyper recommended, especially with the environment that you can be in. Remember, I just kind of mentioned that I have power outages pretty often, and there was a time where I was in the middle of saving and then the power went out. So what happens when you save and your project gets terminated during the save? Well, your project gets corrupted. And then if it's a corrupted file, you're not allowed to open your project again. So what I ended up doing is, hey, that happened, it sucked, and I basically lost all my time. I lost all my systems, I lost everything. But because I had a backup system, a backup save literally that day ago, then yeah, I might have lost 6 hours of production, but I'd rather lose 6 hours than, years or months or weeks worth of work when I can just back it up and move on. So make a practice of doing that. I would recommend the last 10 minutes of development, stop, take a break, back that up. And if your game takes like 10 minutes to actually back up, that's a really good way how you can kind of like time up your bedtime schedule, right? Which, by the way, I'm going to talk about that in a second here because there are going to be other things that you have to do in your personal life that you should, sacrifice, right? I am a huge, I like working out. I'm active on that. I really think it's important to exercise. The argument shouldn't be, oh, you should exercise. No, it's like you are expected to exercise. It's healthy for you. You need to do it, okay? And that's not an argument. But what I'm saying is, do you have to be on the treadmill for an hour and then spend another hour working out? Do you have to play basketball for 3 hours with your friends? Do you have to sign up for that pickleball tournament? When you're in these deadlines that require you, that demand you for these focus and like making sure that you're doing all these things, there's gonna be some moments where like, hey, maybe I can take a break from this, and you might feel guilty about it at first, but it's like, hey, what's more important, the respect of the deadline or these extra activities, right? Like I said, make sure you work out, make sure you exercise. That's important. I'm not saying, forget that. But I'm also saying you don't have to spend half a day doing a marathon when you can literally just hop on the treadmill for like half an hour, get your health on check, basic workouts, and then move on. And so what I was talking about with the bed, there's this hack, right? Where you should set an alarm to go to bed and then don't put an alarm in the morning. Because what happens is when you set an alarm to go to bed, especially if it's early, you naturally are going to build your internal clock to wake you up earlier. And then what happens is if you get in the habit of waking up early consistently, you are now naturally waking up earlier. Also, if you take away the alarm in the morning, you are going to wake up without interruption, which means you're going to have slightly more energy than usual. And then guess what? Wait a minute, I'm waking up 5 a.m. consistently in the morning. I go to work, I drive to work starting at like 7:30. That still means I have like an extra hour in the morning. Huh. So you're saying I can be more productive, more energetic, and use the first hour of the morning to develop? Well, what does it cost to do that? Putting an alarm at night? Okay, I'll do that. That's literally all it is. It's such a huge hack, and I can't recommend it enough. And so, everything I just said, once again, does not matter. Everything that I just said does not matter if you don't assess the deadline, okay? I'm going to probably repeat the slide one more time because I cannot exaggerate that the deadline is the most important key. It is the trick. It is the requirement for success. But it only matters as much as you give it the importance to. If you respect it, if you work with it, if you do what you got to do, boom, it's going to be great. If you don't do that, guess what? You're not going to reach the deadline. Always focus on the deadline, no matter what, okay? Now, I'm going to give you a secret, okay, on the key structure on how to build your game quickly, okay? You follow this structure right now, promise you your game is going to be done super quick, okay? So check this out. The number one thing is you got to make a start menu, okay? Super simple stuff, but you need to make sure that the players know what they're getting into and, basic start menu, okay. The next thing you're going to work on is the core gameplay loop. And so you want to make sure that, hey, like, I'm building the game, that it's replayable, that it can do what it has to perform. If it's a narrative game, it might not be replayable. But the whole point is, like, work and build on the actual game. And so the next part, this is the crazy part, ready? The next part is, that's it. A game only needs you to start it, actuate it, and then just play it. That's it. That's all your game needs, okay? Now, of course, there are supporting systems, right? In my case, I need a game mode. I need my character select. I need my result screen. I need to unlock. I need my customization menu. I need all these things. Absolutely necessary if the scope requires you to have that. So I think in a roguelike, you should have character select. I think in a roguelike, you should have customization menus. I think in a roguelike, you should unlock items. Like, that's why I added these systems. But if I don't do that, then I'm going to have those issues where I have multiplayer, and then I have another chance, and I have retro mode, things that don't matter, okay? The only exception that you need to have, because this is a requirement that it's not that it's underserved, but I genuinely believe players need this, and so I made sure that I added this first in my game before I added anything else, is a settings menu. And this is, the reason why is because a lot of players might like to play full screen or windowed. They might want to have some audio control. They might, your game might offer different controllers, and so you might want to put a setting where players can choose what they want. Maybe there's a save file option that they want to delete so that they can speedrun or something. And so you need to make sure that you do this first, because I remember I was having the situation where I was writing the sound effects system, and what happened was all of the sound effects were basically doing their own thing. And then when I wrote the settings screen, I was like, whoa, wait a minute. Now I have to redo the sound effects systems to respect the settings menu. So that was the first mistake I made a while ago with another game, right? So the lesson that I learned when I was running this one is I'm going to do the settings first so that all of the other components, such as sound effect and screen size and UI systems, respect whatever the settings says first. So if my volume is at 0%, that means all of my sound effect systems must be quiet. If it's at 100%, okay, then the sound effect systems can do what they want. But this is really important. This is really necessary. It is a requirement. It is expected that games have settings menu, and you should really do that. So remember, start menu, settings menu, the gameplay loop, and then supporting systems that help you with your gameplay loop. That's all you need. Okay. Also, you can take advantage of player agency, right? So player agency, for context real quick, is how the player recognizes or figures things out on their own, specifically in the context of the game. And so I remember I was having this dilemma where I needed to write a tutorial, right? And the problem with the tutorial is that it would require me to write a dialogue system, a cutscene, and then make and animate certain sprites and like special art to make sure that the players know what's going on. But the thing is, I remember when I was playtesting the game with players that never played the game, but also two, never played video games in general, they found out that the game was extremely intuitive. In Dodge King, all you have to do is move, attack, shield, and dodge roll. Moving apparently is extremely intuitive because in the game you can see that there's arrow keys that you can literally follow, and then players can recognize, oh, this is how I move. So it's WASD, arrow keys, Xbox controller joysticks, gamepad, D-pads, all these things, right? But then, wait a minute, how do I attack? Players will learn how to attack by standing in front of enemies, but they also have the option to press the spacebar or the A button on their gamepad. And so there's some things that are pretty obvious, but I realized, wait a minute, I'm playtesting this game with my audience here, with my playtesters, and they're pretty much picking up all the things that they have to know. Maybe they don't know about how to shield or how to dodge roll, but they know the basics, and it looks like they can figure it out. So instead of spending an entire week making the art assets for a tutorial and making a proper tutorial, all I did was hint in-game, hey, press the escape button to pause, and when you do this, you might find something new. So when you pause, you have a little instruction manual that tells you, you press this button for attack, you press this button for shield, and you press this button for dodge roll. That's it. So because I recognized, wait a minute, playtesters are smart, they know how to do this. Even testers that never played a video game again, because that's something you can also test. If the game is intuitive and simple enough, there's also types of content you can cut. And yeah, it's controversial to say, oh yeah, my game doesn't have a tutorial, but literally with the pause menu, you have what you need and players can figure it out. So if you know that player agency exists, and more importantly, if you recognize that the playtesters find your game intuitively, you do this by measuring if people actually play your game and, you do a playtest and you see how it works. If you can see and recognize that their intuitiveness of the game allows them to have good player agency for you to cut content, what's the point of writing a tutorial if they know how to play the game already, right? Of course, little controversial, but that's the decision that I made, which saved me again a week and a half of time of just getting the game out. For art assets, making art is essentially a large time sink because of how many things you have to do. I respect artists; I think they're amazing. I love them all, but at the same time, like it's a lot of work to do. And so, as an indie dev, making art could easily be 50% of the game itself. And so, whether you self-create art, delegate art, or simply, you know, recycle art, I think the cheat code for making art quickly is selecting a color palette because you basically turn off your brain on choosing whatever colors you want, right? So, for example, the first character here, Laura, she has white hair, and then she has a dark lily pad with gold, and then it's also green and blue. And the thing is, like, there's no wrong answer for what colors I chose because the color palette respected itself. Now, yes, there are color theory things you have to be aware about, like the shades, the gradients, making sure that it's not cluttered. There's a lot of things that you can keep in mind, right? But I genuinely cannot recommend enough having a color palette because it just makes the process of making art and things that are visually appealing 10 times faster, 10 times easier, and it stops you from stressing if the game looks clean or beautiful. It just helps you elevate that. So really remember that. I probably mentioned this already, but in this entire conversation, you are trying to be as simple as possible. If you don't need a tutorial, cut it out. If you don't need multiplayer, cut it out. If you don't need 2 other extra games, cut it out. If your weapon system could be as simple as, oh, get hit, take damage, that's it, then use that. You don't have to overcomplicate everything. Simplicity is the king of time. You can save everything by being simple. But what I just really want to say here is there's going to be moments where you probably have the preference of keeping a certain item, and then you just have to be impersonal about it and say, hey, I would have liked this, but for the next time, I'll just cut this out, keep this in the back burner so that in my next project, I can go ahead and work on it. Really find ways to simplify as much as you can because you would be very surprised what systems you actually don't need at the end of the day. Again, all of this is to continue getting closer to your endpoint. And then speaking of simple stuff, I think this is a little bit technical but also funny. Invest in skeletal/modular systems as much as possible, right? The idea is I want to make a game object that scales. So there's other things that can control without being dependent. Hey, wait a minute, what if I increase attack? What if I increase HP? What if I increase shields? The speed of attacking, the amount of time I spend on my iframes, right? There's a lot of things you can do that make systems very modular, and it's really important that you have these things because it allows your development to basically get sped ran, because here you have so much control of what should happen that the game basically makes its own like environment of like, okay, well, this enemy does this item does that. All you have to do is these little signals and you're set, right? So that's the whole point of the modular system, just making things accessible and quick for you as the developer to make things quickly. But I would argue 75% of your development process should use these modular systems, right? But after the 75% mark, break it. Lose respect. Disrespect the modular system. I say this because I remember I was writing a whole boss manager system, and I realized I am just spending way too much time doing this. I could save days worth of work if I just added one line of code that would ruin the modularity of the system. But if I did this, I would save time. And so part of running through the deadline is literally just making those choices of, hey, what if I just kind of break the rules a little bit for things that were intended to be modular, things that were intended to be scalable, just to have those compromises, just have those little specific scenarios. And yeah, it may not be healthy long term because if you want to have a really professional project, of course you want to be as modular as possible. But when you're really racing towards the launch, it's so easy to make these decisions and you just save so much more time. So remember that not everything has to be perfect, not everything has to be modular. It's okay to break the rules every now and then, remember, as it supports your goal of getting to the point you want to get to. Another thing that I really, really enjoyed from Scott H. Young, who basically is the author of Ultra Learning, is he is a person that learns from the actual situation that he's in. So for example, in one of his examples, he was learning how to speak Japanese literally by going to Japan without knowing a single word of Japanese, right? And I think the most interesting part of the story is that he's interacting with a bunch of civilians who are basically using words that he doesn't know, but he's picking up patterns, failing quickly, and realizing, wait, okay, this word means that, okay, cool. And so he also mentions, or at least implies, that there's a software tool called Anki. And Anki is basically a flashcard algorithm that re-shows the word that you're most likely to mess up on. And so it does this frequently so that it builds your memory of, okay, For example, you're learning Japanese, right? And then you see a symbol, you don't know what it is, you skip it. And then it comes back 5 letters later, and you're like, oh, wait, I've seen this. Maybe I'm good with it, maybe I'm not. I'll skip it again. And then it comes back a fourth time, a third time, and it's like, whoa, wait, I think I recognize this. And so that pattern recognition that Anki helps you provide allows you to learn patterns super quickly. So combine ultra learning with Anki, and you basically have a tool to speedrun and learn languages. Now we're talking about Japanese and everything, but what's stopping you from learning code? So when I was learning C++, I actually used this method to learn most of the language. And actually, when I was learning Unity all the way at the beginning, I also did the same thing for a couple of these items. But 90% of all of my scripts in Dodge King literally use these components. So I would say if you Anki'd these words and then you actually knew what it meant in a coding context, then you can suddenly speedrun programming. You can suddenly make syntax super quickly. Of course, you can run into errors and fix that, and you learn as you go. But you'll realize that you can do a lot with a little, and it's so critical that when you use that little trick to just, again, speedrun your skill set to get to make the decisions that you have to do, you end up being faster and more efficient, right? And so all of this ultimately concludes to, and I'm going to get to that in a point, but like, if you know how to read the API, if you know how to code, if you know how to do all these things, you're just going to be faster and more efficient. I'm not saying learn the API, but I'm saying learn how to read the API so that you know what properties are, you know how things work and matter, right? But the whole point of all of this is that you can do so many extra tricks to just get better at coding, to get better at syntax, to get better at learning what works, what doesn't work. And so it might sound extreme, like, oh, am I really going to use a flashcard algorithm to learn how to code quicker, right? When obviously there's other tools, there's the whole console log that literally tells you, hey, there's an error, try to fix this, try to fix that. Things that are totally valid, I understand that. But at the end of the day, you can take those decisions to actually continue building your speed on reaching those deadlines. And the whole conclusion that I want to get to with the technical part of game development is that all of it, and I'm going to say this because I genuinely feel like this, right? I remember being super intimidated with game dev because, oh, there's so many hats we got to wear. There's so many things we have to do. But everything about game development is literally just cause and effect on steroids. That's literally all it is, okay? So what I mean by this is, look at this image, right? I have a condition where there's a character with 3 health. I want to press a button, do damage, and make the health go from 3 to 1. The if I press button, and then the result is, hey, they lose health, that's the attack system. And so every single system, UI, art, animation, script, item, everything you do is literally just a big, if this happens, then this happens, right? You as a developer are the bridge of making that effect occur. So, and that's what we call syntax, right? You write the syntax, you write the line of code to make this happen. And it's so easy to say, oh, things are complicated, things are difficult, but every single programming problem that you'll ever run into literally comes down to, hey, what is the cause? What is the effect I'm trying to do? And what is the one line of code that makes that happen? That's literally all it is. It's really simple. And once I saw it that way, I realized I'm not intimidated to tackle an upgrade system that roguelikes do. I'm not intimidated because you just learn, I want this effect, so I just have to build that result. And I just have to make that line of code that does. That's literally game dev in a nutshell. So everything that I just mentioned, no excuses on making the features that you need, because guess what? It's just a line of code. It's just a cause and effect. That's literally what it is. When you recognize that, oh, wait a minute, that endpoint? Okay, what are my ifs and elses that I have to do to actually get there? So I'm going to start concluding by saying, hey, Aristotle once said that we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. You are your habits, what you do, what you become, the character that you are, the personality traits that you have. All these things come down to who you are as a person, okay? And then I would also say that self-imposed limits are simply untested beliefs. And I'm saying this from a place of frustration because I remember that I was making a game for a year and a half. I tried a bunch of other projects and I'm like, hey, this just feels so slow. This just feels so difficult. Why is it so impossible to make this happen? And I just never thought, hey, is it possible to make a game in 90 days? And I thought about the question and then I just really had to say, why not? Am I willing to make the risk to try it out? And guess what? That's exactly what I did. I took 90 days, did everything possible, worked on my habits, worked on my coding, worked on my visuals, worked on my decision making, worked on my scope, make sure that I was focused. I did all these things to see, is it possible to do 90? And who knows, maybe in the future it might be 60, it might be 30. Remember, game jams exist, right? So like game jams can be made in 4 days. Obviously the scope is incredibly micro, but there's other things you can do to continue accelerating that process. And then I would also say, oh, look what happened the fourth time. You need the deadline. I'm going to repeat this ultimately. If there's anything that you have to learn in the video, it's not only following the deadline, but respecting the deadline to the T. If you can't do that, you're not going to get the results that you want. And so lastly, change isn't easy, but the thing is that we're always changing, right? You are a human. You're going to age. You're going to go from baby to teen to adult to senior citizen. And that means you're going to have different responsibilities. You're going to have different lifestyles. You're going to have different choices. Everything is always in the constant state of changing. What is stopping you from intensifying the change, right? If it's so difficult or uncomforting or hard to change, well, guess what? We're always doing it anyway. You're just choosing the level of difficulty of how much change it is. And that's just the intensity. Oh, 90 days sounds challenging. Okay, then it's challenging. Do it. Oh, maybe I want to start off with 6 months instead. Okay, then that's your choice too. But you know that you're always changing. Therefore, there's nothing wrong with intensifying that, because one way or another, you're going from point A to point B, whether you like it or not. So lastly, you're a game developer. Congratulations. Like I said, you are basically wearing all these hats. You're doing a bunch of things. I really hope that this video helped you with, understanding a little bit more about what we can do to speedrun game development, how to make it easier, the choices that we have to do, how to stop overscoping, how to stop procrastinating, which again, deadlines, these micro decisions that we make that play such a big fundamental role, how to challenge yourself. These are all the things you can end up doing, and I have no doubts you can do this, because game developers should be respected more, by the way, because we are all wearing a lot of hats. We're trying to execute as much as we can. We are trying to do more than what we are given, and it's really important that we just assess how we deal with these things, right? And so my last quote here is, remember, launching a game in a quick turnaround time requires hard decisions that go beyond the scope of actual game development. The quality of these decisions are essential if you want to achieve higher level goals, and you are absolutely more than capable of doing so. I hope that this video helped you with those tips and advices. Remember to check out Powerful Habits to Make Games Quickly, which is the other video that talks about how to make those habits. And once again, thank you for your time to actually get here. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to comment. And yeah, I'm very confident that you guys know what to do if you guys need anything else. So until next time, I'll see you. Once again, thank you for your time. Have a wonderful game development journey.